For 2,000 years, these people have been staring back. Not statues, not sketches, faces painted from life, then bound over the bodies of the dead. Look at her eyes. She was alive when someone mixed these colors, and she is still looking at you. We are used to the ancient world arriving in fragments. A broken nose, a blank marble stare, eyes with no color, skin with no warmth. And then you turn a corner, and there is a young woman looking directly at you. Her lips are slightly parted. There is a highlight of light on the tip of her nose. Her earrings are gold. Her gaze is not the gaze of a symbol or a god. It is the gaze of a specific person who knew she was being looked at. These are the Fayum mummy portraits. Around 1,000 of them survive. They come mostly from a green oasis southwest of Cairo, and from the towns strung along the Nile in the first 3 centuries after Christ. They are the most lifelike faces to survive from the entire ancient world, and almost no one set out to make art. They were made to be buried, but before we lower them into the ground, who were these people? And why does a woman dead for 2 millennia look like she could stand up and speak? Stay with me, because the answer is stranger and sadder than it looks. To understand the faces, you have to understand where they lived. Egypt, in the 1st century after Christ, was a Roman province, but it had been ruled by Greeks for 300 years before that, since the generals of Alexander the Great. So the people of the Fayum lived inside 3 worlds at once. They spoke Greek and wrote it. They were governed by Rome and paid its taxes. And when they died, they were embalmed and wrapped as Egyptians had been for 3,000 years. Their names tell the same story. We know some of them because the Romans loved paperwork, and the dry sand kept it. A man named Artemidorus, a woman named Iseros, Greek names, Egyptian names, and sometimes both, worn by the same family. They dressed in the height of Roman fashion. The women wear gold and pearls and the deep red tunics of the empire, their hair curled and pinned in the styles of the imperial court. The men are clean-shaven, or bearded exactly like whatever emperor happened to be ruling. You can actually date some portraits just by the hairstyle, the same way we might date an old photograph by its clothes. They were, in other words, extraordinarily ordinary, middle-class provincials in a corner of the empire, which makes what they left behind almost unbearable to look at. Because to paint a face this real, you had to sit in a room with someone and watch them. Here is the secret behind why these faces feel so alive. Most were painted using a technique called encaustic, pigment mixed into hot beeswax. The artist worked fast, before the wax cooled and set. They pushed the wax on with heated metal tools, building the face in thick, buttery strokes. A blade of light down the nose, a warm shadow under the cheekbone, a wet gleam at the corner of the eye. Because wax doesn't fade the way ordinary paint does, the color survived. 2,000 years later, the skin still looks like skin. The highlights still look wet. Tilt one of these panels in the light and the surface is almost sculptural. You can see where the painter's blade pressed and dragged, the wax standing in tiny ridges, catching the light exactly the way a living cheek would. It is closer to oil painting than anything else the ancient world produced, and Europe would not paint faces this convincingly again for more than 1,000 years. Others were painted in tempera, pigment and agar glue, flatter, cheaper, faster. Because these were commissioned objects, there was a price list. A wealthy family bought a luminous encaustic panel. A poorer one got a plain tempera sketch. Grief, it turns out, has always come with a budget, and that raises the question that has haunted scholars for a century. Were these faces painted from the living person or after death? Because the answer changes everything about what you're looking at. Look closely, and the faces divide into two kinds. Some are worn adults with lined faces and steady eyes. And some are children. The children are the hardest to look at, because a person in the ancient world did not usually reach old age, disease, childbirth, a cut that turned to infection. Many of these people died young, in their 20s and 30s, some far younger. When Egyptologists have run modern scans on the mummies, still sealed behind their portraits, the bodies often match the painted age. A face painted as a young man, and beneath the wrappings the skeleton of a young man. The portrait was telling the truth. So historians believe many of these panels were painted from life, while the person was young and well, and then kept in the house, perhaps hung on a wall or wrapped in cloth, until the day they were finally needed. Some panels show scratches and handling wear, as if they were touched and moved for years before the burial. Imagine that, a portrait of your daughter, painted at 15, waiting quietly in the front room, neither of you knowing which one it would outlive. Others were clearly made in a hurry after death, features slightly generic, as if the painter never met the subject at all. But the strangest evidence isn't in the faces. It's in the wrappings, because these portraits were never meant to hang in a gallery. This is the part the museum labels rarely dwell on. The portrait was not framed and displayed. It was cut down to size, laid over the embalmed face, and wrapped into the bandages, bound directly to the corpse. The living face and the dead body fused into one object. The Egyptian belief behind it was thousands of years old, that the dead needed a recognizable face to survive in the next world, so the wandering soul could find its way home to the body it belonged to. For 3,000 years, Egyptians had solved this with idealized golden masks, the smooth, ageless faces of gods, the same for a king as for a commoner. The Fayum families did something quietly radical. Instead of a golden god mask, they used a portrait of the actual person. A real nose, a real scar, a real expression, imperfect, specific, unmistakably human. And then they buried it. All that skill, all that fire and wax and watching, sealed in a tomb, meant never to be seen again. These are perhaps the only great portraits in history painted to be hidden forever, which is why we almost never found them at all, until one man went digging in the sand and pulled 100 faces back into the light. In the 1880s, a British archaeologist named Flinders Petrie began excavating a cemetery at a site called Hawara, on the edge of the Fayum. He found them by the dozen, mummies with painted panels still bound to their faces, preserved by the bone-dry Egyptian sand. Petrie was moved by them in a way he rarely was by anything. These were not kings. They were shopkeepers, mothers, soldiers, children, ordinary people who had simply wanted to be remembered. But the recovery was also a kind of second death. Bodies were separated from their faces. Panels were sold, scattered across the museums of the world, cut loose from the names and the graves they belonged to. Many now hang anonymous. A face with no name, no town, no story. The very thing the portrait was made to prevent. To be forgotten. And so they wait in glass cases, from London to New York to Cairo, looking out, still trying after 2,000 years. We call them art now. They never meant to be. They were an act of love and of fear, a refusal to let a face vanish into the dark. Every one of them was someone's daughter, someone's father, someone the painter watched breathe. You looked at them. That was all they ever asked. If this stayed with you, Subscribe, we bring the lost world's people back, one face at a time.